I'm a teacher, or at least I was a teacher for 35, 36 years. I have now retired from teaching. And I spend my time travelling, talking to people, meeting people, taking photographs. But for 40 years, I have been a collector. I have loved collecting things. I've been interested in collecting a huge range of things, particularly things that are associated with the First World War. Not only have I collected things, but I've also been very lucky that as a teacher, I've been able to introduce my various students of all ages, to things to do with the First World War. I think it's very important that we remember what happened in the First World War. And to that end, I have taught First World War poetry and First World War literature as part of the GCSE syllabus and part of the A-level syllabus for many, many years. I've also been lucky that I've been able to take children of all ages, particularly 13 plus, to go and see the battlefields for themselves. Now, I've been doing that for a long time, and when I started in the 1980s, nobody really was that interested in the First World War. There were very few books on the First World War. There were hardly any films or videos. There really wasn't much around. And certainly now, the First World War has become a real industry. And if you go across to France and Belgium today, it's become what I would call a tourist industry. When I first went, you went to Ypres, and there was one little shop selling a few little books and a few little mementos. If you go to Ypres today, and I was there a couple of weeks ago, every single shop now has got poppies in the window, great, books with poppies on, towels with poppies on, postcards with poppies on, chocolate with poppies on, even gin with poppies on. You can buy poppy gin in Ypres now. As I say, it's become a huge industry. Now, all those years ago, you used to be able to do something which I still do with students, and that is, you used to be able to walk across the battlefields, particularly the battlefields of the Somme. And you used to be able to go and pick up things on the battlefield because 40 years ago, there was a lot of stuff that was still being churned up by the farmers in their fields when they went to plough each year. Now, I'll just give you some examples of some of the things that used to be able to be easily found on the battlefield. There is a British First World War water bottle. Each soldier would have carried that, quite heavy with all the rest of the kit he was carrying, but you can't survive without water, and that is one of the water bottles I found. There's another water bottle. This particular one is probably a French water bottle. Seen better days, it's a bit rusty, but as I say, that was found on the battlefield, on one of the fields near the Somme. There are one or two other things I've got here, some of which you might recognise. Somebody's boot, or the remains of somebody's boot. And this, that is actually from a German gas mask, a German gas respirator. Those little respirators, again, just found in a field. Those were put on the end of a gas mask and you used to change them when it needed changing, and they screwed into the gas mask. German respirator. Remains of a shovel. Remains of a shovel. Not in very good condition. You wouldn't want to be digging your allotment with that now. But that's interesting because I knew that that had been there and not been touched for nearly 100 years. Likewise, just an old bottle. Now, soldiers in the First World War often used to drink, if they had wine in the bottle, great. But when it was empty, they used to be able to put candles in them, and the candle used to be able to light up the dugouts and any other underground fortifications. So again, found just on the field. And the last thing I've just brought over today, the last two things, there are some fired bullet cases with the clip still attached, and there is a piece of barbed wire, almost certainly German barbed wire, because it's not like you get today in fields. German barbs, first of all, were much, much closer together, and secondly, the barbs were much longer. You can probably just about see that. These are long barbs, and if you got your clothing caught on that, you were in serious trouble. I'll show you some pictures of barbed wire emplacements in a minute. But as I was saying, I became very interested many years ago in the First World War, and I started finding things. And these things were actually really useful, particularly with students, because it brought the First World War to life. If you have a little 15, 16-year-old who's been brought up on television and social media and videos, it's quite difficult sometimes to get through to them. And actually taking them, walking them across a field, finding something themselves in a field that hasn't been touched for nearly 100 years, in some ways inspired those students and brought it home exactly that it was real. Wasn't a museum, wasn't a big glass case where you couldn't touch anything. Here was something that a soldier had had in his hands. And we found all sorts of items, including shells, live shells, bombs. 2 weeks ago we found huge bomb, this size, in the field. They're still coming to the surface. There were so many of them actually fired during the First World War. Many of them hit mud and didn't go off. You don't touch them, you don't play with them, but you can certainly see them and you can still find them. We also found a live hand grenade. One of the girls, 15-year-old, found a live hand grenade in the field. Rusty, looked dead. Again, something you wouldn't be wanting to play cricket with or catch with because they're still live and they can still explode. Nowadays, it's more difficult to find really interesting things. So I've got another tack I've tried. I've actually started collecting, many years ago, I started collecting original First World War artifacts. I brought a few with me today. Again, it seems to me that it brings home the reality, the personal quality of the First World War. So much of what we see today, on television today or in films, it's not necessarily personal. And particularly with children, you need to find an angle, something that really hooks their interest. And when they can handle original artifacts belonging to First World War soldiers, I found that that actually was very effective. Some of these you might recognise. This one, for example, this is a Veery pistol. It fires a flare up into the air. The flare comes down, burning, a magnesium flare, burning slowly, and will light up all of no man's land. This very weird little item. Some of you will know that gas was first used by the Germans in 1915 near Ypres. The people at the time didn't have any protection. This was what they came up with first. This is a gas mask. Now notice might protect your eyes in a very minimal way, but it certainly isn't going to protect your lungs. If you breathe the gas in, again, you've got big problems. So a very early gas mask, 100 years old. Little item here, foot powder. Soldiers, many soldiers struggled with what became known as trench foot. Feet's wet for so long that their feet started to rot. This foot powder was meant to help that, and a lot of soldiers would have that in their pack. This, I've talked about gas. You needed to have a gas warning. Did I wake you up? Sorry. That's a gas rattle. First World War, still dated. So actually you wouldn't have very long. When you heard that, you wouldn't have very long. It might be seconds before you had to get your gas mask on. This looks very strange, doesn't it? This is a tank driver's mask. Because the early tanks that went into battle in 1917, if they were hit, they tended to shower shrapnel inside the tank. And this was worn by tank drivers to try and protect their face. This is chainmail, and you can see it's actually steel underneath this leather cover. Very simple, wouldn't protect the rest of your body, but might protect your eyes. And a tank driver needs his eyes. Fun little item here I found. It's a mirror. On the back, it's got a little clip. This was used as, anyone guess? No, it wasn't a signal. Yeah, it's like a periscope. You used to put it on the end of your rifle bayonet and you used to be able to hold it up as a sort of a slightly ineffective periscope. I brought a rifle with me just so you can see. This is a First World War SMLE, small short magazine Lee Enfield rifle. Very, very accurate, up to 600-700 metres. You can fire quite quickly if you're very skilled and disciplined. And certainly Germans on a number of occasions thought they were facing machine guns from a troop of soldiers who were able to fire around 7, 8, possibly even 9 rounds a minute, aimed shots. On the end of your rifle, there is a British First War Lee Enfield bayonet. A pretty vicious looking thing. And that just clips onto the end of the rifle. It's quite long. I can assure you it's also extremely sharp. I'm not going to test it on anybody. A hat. First World War infantryman's hat. Now the reason I brought this one along is because, as you can probably see, it's very small. Almost certainly for a very young soldier. Do you know the age of the youngest British soldier to die in the First World War? 12. 12. And there are quite a few 14-year-olds. I was stood by a grave of a 14-year-old soldier, Private Strudwick, just 2 weeks ago. So a little boy, essentially. And then the last couple of items here. This, it looks like a truncheon. It's actually a trench club. Vicious thing. It's got lead in it. It's very heavy. That one was found by a British soldier in no man's land. That had clearly been used. Soldiers found that the rifle and the bayonet were often a bit cumbersome, and they needed something that was a bit more effective. That is a lot simpler. And this, equally unpleasant, this is called a Robbins Dudley punch knife. It's for punching people. Vicious. Vicious. But those actually giving students weapons like this to actually hold and touch and look at close hand rather than just behind glass brought home for me the reality of First World War, the brutality of it, the mess, the filth, what soldiers actually had to endure. I've got a picture here. One of the last times I went over to the battlefields. This is at High Wood. High Wood saw some of the worst fighting of the First World War. It's in the Somme area. And it was a wood. High Wood. The trouble is here at High Wood, it's not quite like it used to be, as you can probably see. A wood in the First World War didn't usually exist as such. It was a muddy swamp with some duck boards making some sort of path through it and a few tree stumps. I'd like to read you a poem. I've got a number of poems I'm going to read you, and this particular poem is called High Wood, and it was written in 1918 by a guy called Philip Johnson, although his real name was actually Lieutenant Purvis. And he wrote in 1918 that he wondered what it would be like in the future visiting High Wood. And he guessed, probably rightly, that it might well become a tourist attraction. I'll read it to you. High Wood. Ladies and gentlemen, this is High Wood, called by the French Bois de Furneaux, the famous spot where in 1916, July, August and September was the scene of long and bitterly contested strife. By reason of its high commanding site, observe the effect of shell fire in the trees, standing and fallen. Oh, here is wire. Oh, this trench, for months inhabited, 12 times changed hands. Oh, they soon fall in. Used later as a grave. It has been said on good authority that in the fighting for this patch of wood were killed somewhere above 8,000 men, of whom the greater part were buried here. Oh, this mound on which you are standing, madam, please. You are requested kindly not to touch or take away the company's property, the souvenirs. You'll find we have on sale a large variety, all guaranteed. As I was saying, all is as it was. Oh, this is an unknown British officer, the tunic having lately rotted off. Oh, please follow me, this way. Oh, the path, sir, the path. The ground which was secured at great expense, the company keeps absolutely untouched. And in that dugout, genuine, in that dugout, we provide refreshments at a reasonable rate. You are requested not to leave about paper, or ginger beer bottles, or orange peel. There are waste paper baskets at the gate. So that is High Wood, a poem slightly bitter, but I think he was right. The First World War battlefields now, it's very difficult to imagine. And when you are taking young people, as I regularly do, you need something that is going to instantly connect them, that can give them a sort of emotional response. Pictures are certainly one of the ways, I think, of doing that. You can do that. Poems are another. This is just a picture of the artillery. People often don't know that the overwhelming majority of casualties were caused by artillery. Not guns, not bayonets, not hand grenades, but artillery. And there were thousands and thousands of shells fired, hence the reason you can still find them buried in the mud. Now have a look at that picture. That's just one mound of empty shell cases. Thousands and thousands of them. Piles and piles of artillery shells. The other thing which I showed you over there a moment ago, which we found, was wire. Now, it's very difficult to imagine, unless you see a picture, of exactly what it meant by wire entanglements, barbed wire. That gives you an idea. Barbed wire that would cover a considerable distance. You saw how big the barbs were. And have a look at this next picture. It gives you an even better idea of what some of the soldiers had to fight in and to cross. There are barbed wire entanglements. Only way of getting across them, as you can see there, is by tank. By far the most scary weapon for many people of the First World War was this. There it is. There is a British machine gun, a Vickers heavy machine gun. It would fire around 600 rounds a minute, and it's fed by a belt. And that is one of the major reasons that trenches came into place as a means of defending yourself, hiding if you like, because if you're running towards a machine gun that is firing 600 rounds a minute at you, in a matter of a second, 2 seconds, you will be minced. It would be terrible. And not only one machine gun, but you would have a large number of machine guns all set up. Notice the trench there. Hardly what you think of as a trench, just some muddy shell holes. My children, I taught, were actually quite lucky because they were actually able to see an actual machine gun. There is a First World War heavy machine gun. It's big and it's scary and it makes a lot of noise. I'll just show you a short video clip of a machine gun actually being fired, just to give you some idea.
Stand easy. Been at the bayonet demonstration, have you? Might have been useful at Waterloo. Up the line, they mostly get used for opening jam tins. Let's have a look at the real queen of the modern battlefield.
Number 1, load. Number 2, load. Number 1, ready, sir. Number 1, fire.
gentlemen, is why there's a continuous trench from the North Sea to the Swiss border. As long as the machine gun's intact, neither side can cross no man's land. Our enemy, the German army, is extremely skillful in their use of it. Their gunners are hand-picked, and they use them like this. Crossfire. The entire front is crisscrossed like that.
What's the answer then, sir?
Guns? Bombs? Bravery, perhaps. There isn't a real answer. Not yet.
And that's the problem. There really wasn't an answer when you've got highly defended positions, fortified by barbed wire, protected by machine guns. There's really no way through. Let's take you back to some poems. In 1914, before the war started, people had a good idea that there was a war coming, and we needed soldiers. Now, we didn't have television, social media like we do today. We did have posters. We did have people performing in music halls. But one of the ways in which we managed to recruit extra soldiers was by poems. There were a number of poets who wrote in the First World War, particularly early on, who wrote about men being needed to go off to fight, to play the game. It's described as a great, big, fun game. No mention of being killed, no mention of suffering, no mention of blood. It was your duty to fight for yourself, for your family, for your king, your country, and your God. As a result, we had a number of very patriotic poems. I'll read you one by one of the most famous poets at the beginning of the war, Jessie Pope. Jessie Pope was very popular. Her patriotic poems were read by millions. She wrote them particularly in the Daily Mail. Remember, it's your duty to join up. No blood, no suffering, no death. It's all a big game. And this poem is called Who's for the Game? Who's for the game? The biggest that played. The red crashing game of a fight. Who'll grip and tackle the job unafraid? And who thinks he'd rather sit tight? Who'll toe the line for the signal to go? Who'll give his country a hand? Who wants a turn to himself in the show? And who wants a seat in the stand? Who knows it won't be a picnic? Well, not much, yet eagerly shoulders a gun. Who would much rather come back with a crutch than lie low and be out of the fun? Come along, lads! You'll come on all right, for there's only one course to pursue. Your country is up to her neck in a fight, and she's looking and calling for you. So that is Jessie Pope. Jessie Pope, who wrote a poem that was intended to get young men to join up. In response to that, the poet Wilfred Owen, who many of you will know, wrote a particular poem which he titled Dulce et Decorum Est, which means, the full title, Dulce et Decorum Est, Pro Patria Mori. It's a sweet and fitting thing to die for your country. But he said it in a most ironic way, as the poem reveals. He originally titled his poem, or subtitled it, To Jessie Pope, because he was very angry with the way that certain people were portraying the war. It's a poem about a man he saw who was gassed. Horrible, horrible way to die. Chlorine gas will burn you, burn your skin. If it gets in your eyes, if it's enough of it, it can blind you. You will see pictures of soldiers who have been very badly injured by gas, possibly blinded. Worst of all is if it gets in your lungs, because your lungs will bleed and you will drown in it. And that's what this poem is about. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue. Deaf even to the hoots of tired outstrips gas shells that dropped behind. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil's sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from his froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori. I'd like to read a poem called Dreamers. This particular poem is by Siegfried Sassoon, again, one of the probably most famous poets of the First World War. A brave man who'd won a military cross, but who ended up later in the war insisting that the war should end and that we ought to have war aims stated so that we could have some sort of armistice. It's interesting how he dreams of home, all those little things that we all take for granted and that soldiers dream of in the trench lines of the Western Front. He talks about sitting in a dugout in horrible conditions, dreaming of England. It's called Dreamers. Soldiers are citizens of death's grey land, drawing no dividend from time's tomorrows. In the great hour of destiny they stand, each with his feuds and jealousies and sorrows. Soldiers are sworn to action. They must win some flaming, fatal climax with their lives. Soldiers are dreamers. When the guns begin, they think of firelit homes, clean beds, and wives. I see them in foul dugouts gnawed by rats and in the ruined trenches lashed with rain, dreaming of things they did with balls and bats, and mocked by hopeless longing to regain bank holidays and picture shows and spats and going to the office in the train. This next shot is that is a battlefield. That's actually no man's land. The reason I put that particular photo up is because that's one of the very few photos that were taken during the Battle of the Somme, early in the Battle of the Somme. It was taken from British trenches, and the German trenches are about 600 metres away in the distance. But the interesting thing and the sad thing, all those little dots in the middle, those are all men who've been shot and died. I'm going to read you one other poem by Philip Johnson. Remember he wrote the poem High Wood? Well, here's another poem called Chance Memories. A poem I, again, rather like, because again, it thinks of home, what he's missing out on. And he particularly talks about Stenning. Now, I used to live very near Stenning, it's in Sussex, and there is a ring of woods up on the South Downs that's been there for thousands of years. And he talks about Stenning Ring and wishing he was back there, while in fact he's fighting at the Somme. It's called Chance Memories. I can't forget the lane that goes from Stenning to the Ring in summer, and on the downs how larks and linnets sing high in the sun. The wind comes off the sea and oh, the air. I never knew till now that life in old days was so fair. But now I know it is, in this filthy rat-infested ditch, where every shell must kill or spare, and God alone knows which. And I am made a beast of prey, and this trench is my lair. My God, I never knew till now that those days were so fair. And we assault in half an hour, and it's a silly thing. I can't forget the lane that goes from Stenning to the Ring. Interesting picture, that particular one. Again, it gives you an idea. We often see pictures of very nice, clean-cut trenches. Trenches often were nothing more than a few shell holes joined together with a ditch. And here you can see the remains of a wood. Remember I showed you High Wood early on. This is just what a trench might well have looked like. This particular poem, next one, is by Siegfried Sassoon, and it's again about going on the attack. It's called Attack. At dawn, the ridge emerges, massed and done in the wild purple of the glowering sun, smouldering through spouts of drifting smoke that shroud the menacing scarred slope. And one by one, tanks creep and topple forward to the wire. The barrage roars and lifts. Then, clumsily bowed with bombs and guns and shovels and battle gear, men jostle and climb to meet the bristling fire. Lines of grey, muttering faces, masked with fear, they leave their trenches, going over the top, while time ticks blank and busy on their wrists, and hope, with furtive eyes and grappling fists, flounders in mud. And that was one of the enemies, of course, of the poor old soldier. Look at the thick mud, the mud coming nearly, in many cases, to their knees. You could drown in the mud. You fell off a duckboard into a shell hole full of water, the chances are that was your lot. You'd be sucked in and meet a pretty horrible death. And your body almost certainly would be never found, or found many, many, many years later. Not a very pleasant experience. There's another example. That one was taken at Passchendaele, 1917, the so-called Third Battle of Ypres. Mud, mud, mud. All the British soldiers suffered with it. It became an absolute quagmire. I want to read you two poems that are quite angry, later Sassoon poems, quite bitter. Bitter in the first case with the high-ups, the brass, the generals. Sassoon felt that they were not in touch with the ordinary soldier. This particular poem is called Base Details. If I were fierce and bald and short of breath, I'd live with scarlet majors at the base and speed glum heroes up the line to death. You'd see me with my puffy, petulant face, guzzling and gulping in the best hotel, reading the Roll of Honour. Oh, poor young chap, I'd say. I used to know his father well. Oh, yes, we've lost heavily in this last scrap. And when the war is done, and youth stone dead, I'd toddle safely home and die in bed. That's the first one. And the second one I'd like to read you is called Died of Wounds, where he pictures a very badly wounded soldier in hospital behind the lines, although nobody quite realises how bad he is. He is having nightmares. He's having nightmares because of the rain, because of the mud, and because of the ever-present fear of death, particularly from snipers. Snipers you don't see, you don't hear. They are hidden. A very frightening element of the First World War. Snipers would be hiding behind usually a sniper's shield, and they would wait for a head to pop up, and you never knew where they were. And that is what this soldier is worrying about. Perhaps he's been hit by a sniper and is badly wounded. It's called Died of Wounds. His wet, white face and miserable eyes brought nurses to him more than groans and sighs. But hoarse and low and rapid rose and fell his troubled voice. He did the business well. The ward grew dark, but he was still complaining and calling out for, "Dickie! Oh, curse the wood! It's time to go. Oh, Christ, what's the good? We'll never take it, and it's always raining." I wondered where he'd been, then heard him shout, "They snipe like hell. Oh, Dickie, don't go out." I fell asleep. Next morning, he was dead, and some slight wound lay smiling on the bed. I have two final poems to read you. The first one is by Robert Graves, and again, like Wilfred Owen, he wants to point out the reality of what it all was like for him. It's called A Dead Boche. Boche being a word, as I'm sure you know, for German. To you who'd read my songs of war and only hear of blood and fame, I'll say, you've heard it said before, war is hell. And if you doubt the same, today I found in Mamet's wood a certain cure for lust of blood. Where propped against a shattered trunk, in a great mess of things unclean, sat a dead Boche. He scowled and stunk, with clothes and face a sodden green, big-bellied, spectacles, cropped hair, dribbling black blood from nose and beard. Before I show the last poem, it is a poem many of you will know. It's called In Flanders Fields, and it was written by John McCrae, Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, a Canadian doctor. He wrote it near Ypres, and he wrote it because he saw the poppies blowing near where he was working in a field hospital. We now, all of us, know about wearing poppies and what they represent, but he perhaps was the start of it all. But before that, I'd just like to show you a little short excerpt of me taking a little group back to the battlefields. Children, I hope, who realise the importance of remembrance, because that's what the trip was all about. The grave you saw was a winner of a VC, and the reason for taking the children to that particular grave was because John Leslie Green was a medic, a doctor. He had gone out into no man's land to save a wounded soldier who he brought back to his own lines on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. You probably saw in the graveyard, 1st of July 1916, and he was killed in his efforts. And the reason for taking the children there was that he had been to our school. He was an old Felstedian. In Flanders fields. In Flanders fields the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row that mark our place. And in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw your torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies blow in Flanders fields. Thank you very much.